this unit of the course, we're going to talk about the sensorium. The sensorium simply means the sensory apparatus, how we experience bodily sensations about the world around us and about ourselves. The sensorium is central to the way we get to know the world. How we organize and make sense of our perception also deeply connects with our embodied social values, with the working of power, and with social hierarchies. In this particular cultural context, we tend to give cultural importance to the role of seeing. So for example, you might talk about understanding another person's point of view, or when you agree or understand someone, you can say, I see. But we're going to consider the social and communicative importance of other sensory practices, like a hug, perfume, the taste of rotten food, balancing on your feet while you're walking, shouting, the smell of rain. In everyday discourse, we often talk about the 5 senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Sounds pretty basic, right? But things are a little more complicated. And over time, the sensorium has been classified and reclassified in many different ways. So for example, for the Greek philosopher Aristotle, there were 5 senses, and this sounds pretty familiar to how you might think about the senses today. But each sense in Aristotle's view also corresponded to a particular element of the world, with sight coming from fire, hearing coming from the upper air, and smell from the lower air, and taste from water, and touch from earth. So even though the classification itself sounds pretty similar, the cultural and philosophical ideas underpinning them were very different. In the 1st century, the Greek-Roman doctor Galen of Pergamon in today's Turkey described 6 distinct senses. But in the 19th century, the British naturalist Charles Darwin identified 12. And until the 19th century, the study of the senses had been largely a philosophical question of how we apprehend the world. But in the 19th century, it became a problem of anatomy, about measuring bodily responses to physical inputs. In the mid-20th century, scientists identified 9 sensory systems or sensory apparatuses: a visual apparatus that responds to chromatic impressions, an auditory apparatus that responds to tonal impressions, an olfactory apparatus, an apparatus of taste, and then a tactile apparatus that responds to mechanical impressions, a tactile apparatus that responds to thermal impressions, to temperature, and a 3rd type of tactile apparatus that responds to kinesthetic impressions or proprioception. So for example, the capacity that you have to close your eyes and be able to touch the tip of your nose without looking. The 8th apparatus is the one that governs the ability to balance. And the 9th is an affective apparatus. Things that are pleasant or painful. The responses to things like tickling, burning, or pinching. And to make things even more complicated, scientists also distinguish the difference between internal stimuli, the ability to perceive things like hunger or thirst or weakness or tiredness, and also a sense of direction, the ability to navigate space, sometimes over very long distances. So this research on the senses also demonstrated that we can also improve any kind of perception, any kind of sensory apparatus in just a few hours of training. While we're all born with certain capacities and abilities for sensing in different ways, we all also practice these sensing capacities, and this happens in specific cultural and social contexts. And so to understand the sensorium, we really have to consider its cultural variation. And it might not be surprising to you to consider that a community's sensorium reflects some of its social and cultural values. So this sounds a little abstract, so I'm going to ask you to stop for a second and identify a concrete example of that. So what we call in anthropology a sensory order really reflects aspects of a community's world, aspects of things that are so important to its members that they come to carry them within their own bodies. These are ways of embodying cultural categories and also embodying power. And this will become very clear by the end of this lecture. So in the rest of the lecture, I want to talk about a couple of approaches to the study of sound and then the study of smell. In one of the readings you've done for this unit, you've read about anthropologist Stephen Feld, who conducted fieldwork for several decades with communities of Kaluli people in the forest of Papua New Guinea. Kaluli people live in the tropical forest on the slopes of a mountain called Mount Bozavi. And in fact, they refer to themselves as Bozavi people, speaking Bozavi language. And Kaluli is a subsection of the Bozavi people. So in the 1970s, when Stephen Feld began his fieldwork there were about 1,200 Bozavi living in the area. The Kaluli were Sweden agriculturalists. They grew crops like sago, banana, breadfruit, and also many green vegetables. They also fished and they hunt pigs and game. It was a pretty egalitarian society, meaning it didn't have large disparities in wealth or power. People often lived in communal longhouses with 60 to 80 other people, and extensive networks of obligations and reciprocity connected people to each other even across long distances. The community, of course, had been heavily impacted by missionary work since the 1970s and had experienced severe economic exploitation and land loss. Stephen Feld immediately found that the rainforest is absolutely central to Kaluli life. Living in the rainforest, think about ridges and valleys and slopes and water flowing everywhere and the canopies of trees really requires developing very acute auditory perception skills. You need to hear the rainforest to find your way through it. You never quite see when you are in the forest, at least not at a long distance, in the thicket of trees, but you can hear it. And you can hear the passing of time through the sounds of birds, water flows, animals, and other people. So it's not just spatial direction, but it's temporal as well. And this way of navigating the forest through sound is a particular embodiment of perception. For Kaluli people, the sense of hearing is essentially connected to the sense of smell. And in fact, Kaluli, Stephen Feld found, used the same verb, dabuma, which means absorption by ear and by nose. It literally means to hear the odor. And Kaluli have their own theory about sonic perception, summarized by the philosophical concept of dulugu ganalan, which means lift up over sounding. The concept of lift up over sounding simply means that sounds are layered, they're staggered in place, and they're also layered in time. And in fact, when there is no a clearly dominant sound in the forest, everything comes to you in mixed and interlocked ways. And to be a Kaluli and to navigate the forest means to be able to unpack and untangle these layers of sound. And so hearing sound always relates to an understanding of space, but it also relates to an understanding of past, present, and future sounds. It's very much about telling the history of the forest and the history of the communities that live through it. And so as the Kaluli hear and smell the overlapping layers of the rainforest and its historic transformations, this is a history that's closely entangled with the thick social lives of the Kaluli people as they live in and transform this rainforest environment. This particular conceptualization of a mode of perception, this local theory of lift up over sounding, inspires Kaluli musical forms. There are songs that tumble like waterfalls and like rain. And there are songs that move around in space just like birds. And Kaluli talk about their voices and the musical instruments as lifting up over the forest canopy. And so this interplay of human, natural, and animal sound making is really important to everyday Kaluli experience. And people early on learn to make, to respond to, and interpret this landscape of sound. And there is different categories of sound. For example, there is weeping, there is poetry, there is song, there is whistling, there is noise, there is talk, and each are used to express kind of core social sentiments and emotions. There is another really important concept in Kaluli theory that Stephen Feld writes about and tries to unpack in his work, and this is the concept of abalan, which means flow. So think about the flow of water in the rainforest, or think about the flow of a path traced in the forest. And Kaluli songs are very often structured as a sequence of names of places which form a path. So in singing a song and in listening to the song, you're retracing the path of the song through these name places that indicate both existing places in the forest, but also the people who've lived there and who have shaped this landscape. These things are closely connected and inseparable. And in fact, Kaluli people frequently travel, obviously to and from their longhouses, to the gardens, to their sago fields, to other longhouse communities around Mount Bozavi. But they also move much longer distances working as wage laborers and migrants in Papua New Guinea and beyond. And for Kaluli, this movement is so important, the idea that all the places you've been to and what you've done there really make you who you are as a person. And I would like you to pause for a second again and ask you a second question, which is to reflect on the places that you have been to and through and the ways in which they make you who you are. Okay, back to the rainforest of Papua New Guinea. So every Kaluli social relation, the relationship established between two or more people, is also embedded in place. It's also very much about the place in which that relationship unfolded and took place. And so every place in the forest and in the mountain is known as a place where social interactions have occurred, a place with its own human history. And Kaluli people also describe landforms, forests, and water as human bodies. And human bodies in turn get described using metaphors of mountains and forests and water. And the Kaluli song help people in the community tell and remember and pass on these histories as they connect people and places. Another really central aspect of Kaluli worldview, as Stephen Feld finds out, is the importance of people's relationship to the rainforest birds. Birds are obviously mediators of sound. Think about the bird songs and their calls and how they travel over the long distance and how they lift up over the canopy of the forest. But birds are also mediators of human life. In fact, Kaluli consider birds to be the spirit of the dead and to carry the memories of the dead as they interact with the living people. So at a traditional Kaluli funeral, women typically sing songs of a genre called gizalo, and these songs are really close to the sounds of birds. Gizalo songs are also sorts of acoustic maps of lived places, and there are maps of histories and there are maps of Kaluli kinship relations. They are this really like memory form through sound. And they are characterized by really complex structures, often narrated from the perspective of a bird flying overhead. And this song traditionally were part of a man's singing repertoire, but as labor relations were transformed with the advent of missionary work and wage labor and migrant communities, they became much more of a women domain, and men, by the time Stephen Feld was conducting research in Bozavi, men were no longer the holders and the singers of Gizalo songs, or not as much as they had been in the past. Let me take you now from this thick, sonic, olfactory landscape of the Bozavi rainforest to thinking about the perception of smell. Smell is often strongly associated with memory and with emotions. Think about a smell that you remember and think about all of the stories connected to it and all of the emotions that this smell can bring up in you, even as you recall it, or even better, as you smell something that creates that connection to a different context. And this association of smell with memory and emotion partly has to do with how it's processed in the brain, in the limbic system. It has to do with the amygdala and the hippocampus. But more pertinent to an anthropology lecture, think about the connection of smell and taste and food with a sense of identity, family, community, and a sense of self. But the classification of smell often also maps other social categories and power differentials. And this is because of its association with such strong emotional responses of pleasure and disgust, of fear and attraction. And so smell is often used as a symbolic element in many rituals of passage. Smell goes through boundaries, is ephemeral, it can move, but it can also linger in place. And it can bond the community together, and it can distinguish it through smell from other groups. So in other words, we can think about smell as offering a moral commentary, meaning smell often is about how we talk about what we perceive as being good or bad, right or wrong, desirable and attractive, or undesirable and disgusting. And this is very clear if we consider the history of soap in a Euro-American context. In the early 19th century, soap was a pretty scarce commodity in England. Ordinary households would launder their clothes pretty infrequently and bathe about once a month. But by the end of the century, the sale of soap has soared. Advertisement campaigns convinced the growing middle class to consume new goods and to keep them clean. Imperial cotton production in plantations cultivated by enslaved Africans in the Americas and in cotton plantations in colonial India and Egypt had led to a surplus of cheap cotton. And plantations in West Africa and in the Pacific world also brought sources of cheap palm, coconut, and cottonseed oil that you can use to manufacture soap. And changing industrial technologies allowed for the large-scale commercial production of cheap body soaps. Before, these suds were really more like an upper-class luxury commodity. But culturally, soap fit a particular Victorian moral value of racial hygiene and also mapped onto ideas of imperial progress. And let me unpack this connection for you. So if you look at early soap advertisements from the late 19th century, you notice that they were really racialized, really racist, and pretty classist too. They would often feature black working class people holding luminous, bright white bars of soap in their hands. Soap in these advertisements promised to clean that which was considered dirty, and dirty not just in a physical sense, but in a moral and in a social way as well. So soap would clean children, pets, but also working class workers and domestic servants. These ideas of impurity and purity really built on racial and racist discourses. This is also a period where women were drawn from paid work in the factory to do more and more unpaid work in the house. And so a middle class wife who hired domestic servants to perform their domestic work, to kind of separate herself from them. And soap in its advertisements almost promised to cleanse women from the visible signs of domestic labor. Whitening the skin through soap would distinguish elites from the sun-darkened manual workers, and also from human societies considered to be inferior. Think back to the ladder of civilization that we talked about in the second unit of this course. And soap also prominently featured as a symbol of civilization, something that white people would hand out to other supposedly more primitive cultures, transforming them into morally clean modern subjects, and also at the same time subjugating them as imperial subjects or eliminating them. These moral judgments about cleanliness, about hygiene, were often used to legitimize the enforcement of colonial, cultural, and economic values and political rule. So the meaning of soap in this cultural context worked to naturalize racial hierarchies by transforming them instead into a seemingly neutral discourse about cleanliness, about purity, about bodily odor. And I wanted to think anthropologically here and going back to the idea of rituals and think about purification rituals as practices that reorganize bodies as sites of meaning making, that map values about the self and community, and also that demarcate boundaries between people and between groups of people, and they make them seem natural, embodied. And purification is also an exercise of power, of violence, and of constraint. And invalidating the boundaries and the cleansing rituals of others is a violent act. And particularly since of the sense of disgust, as we experience it as a marker of class and racial distinction. Can you think about a concrete example of that? So to wrap up, sensory experiences have been very declassified over time in different ways, in different complicated intersecting ways. And one of the findings of this classification efforts had been the human capacity to acquire and fine-tune sensory apparatuses through practice, and a capacity that is shaped by the cultural context in which this occurs. And the sensorium marks things that communities may consider to be appropriate or immoral, desirable or scary. And we learn to perceive a sensory world in ways that sometimes reproduce and naturalize ethnic, racial, and class boundaries between communities. And ideas of the senses can also articulate oppositions and divisions between sex and genders as well. The sensorium produces an effect of social order that we come to take for granted. Remember the doxa, Pierre Bourdieu's notion of that which is an unspoken truth, a taken for granted reality. So the sensorium really gives this sense and illusion of reality, but also really carries a history and a culture and a politics within it. And your role as anthropologists in training is to be able to unpack sensory practices and situate them in their specific cultural and social context, and also to see them as venues where politics is made and where humans draw distinctions and also similarities amongst ourselves. This is all for today. Thank you for listening to all of this, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon.